So Sarah Scully asks, how do you choose the size of your aperture when you're doing landscapes on a tripod? How small do you want to push it? F11, F14, F22? And does that depend on the lens quality? So me personally, I know I like to shoot anytime I can get away with like F8, F11, I go that route because most lenses are going to be sharpest at F11 or F8. Now, the one time that that really changes is when you have a foreground that's either really close to you or you just have lots of depth in your shot. Now, if you're standing up on a cliff and everything is far away from you, you might as well shoot at f8 or whatever your lens is sharpest at, because you don't need to try very hard to get enough depth of field. But everything changes if suddenly you have a rock a couple inches from your lens and then the background is way far away. At that point, you're either going to need to focus stack, or you're going to need to use an aperture more like f16, f18 to get enough depth of field to have both the foreground and the background in focus.
Yeah, and the other element here is how big of a sensor are we talking about?
Yep.
If you're shooting a full frame lens, this is a much harder question to answer. If you're shooting a crop sensor camera like I am most of the time, then this is a lot easier of a question to answer. So that's one thing that I like about the crop sensor camera. Is I mostly went to a crop sensor camera because of the size, but also it really is nice when you're shooting landscapes that I just don't need to focus stack hardly ever, because everything's going to be in pretty good focus when you're shooting on a crop sensor camera. Okay, so let's talk about Iceland. Nick and I were in Iceland earlier this year, and we were in Jökulsárlón on the beach, and there were these ice chunks right up on the beach, and you wanted to be right up close to those, and then you had the water and sometimes mountains in the distance and clouds in the distance. So for that, did you focus stack or did you use a high aperture?
So it kind of depends on the shot. If one of the shots that I did was this sunrise shot where, the sun hadn't even crested yet, but we had these beautiful chunks of ice, and then we had the moving water, whole bunch of different elements to try to blend together, because you don't want your shutter speed to go so slow that you lose all of that really cool water action. So I had my choice between using like an f16. But if I did that, I would end up with a shutter speed that was just far too slow, and I would end up with really, really blurry water, which I didn't want at that point. So in those cases, I was using like F11, F8, getting as much depth of field as I could, and then kind of using the hyperfocal distance where I would focus kind of on the back part of the chunk of ice rather than the front part of the chunk of ice. And what that does is it gives me a little bit of leeway where I can get that background a little bit sharper and still have the front of the chunk of ice sharp enough to where people are not going to notice that that wasn't where my focus point was. And that's something called using hyperfocal distance, because you want to get as much of the frame in focus as you can. But at the same time, I was trying to let in enough light to where I didn't have to start increasing my ISO, because there was movement in the shot. Had there not been any movement in the shot, I could just use ISO 100 and use whatever shutter speed I wanted. But when you're shooting moving subjects, it changes everything. And then you have to really think about what's the most important part of this shot.
Yeah, a lot of photographers really worry about this, and so let me just give you the easy answer if you're more of a beginner photographer. Just shoot at f16. Just shoot at f16. F16 is probably the most common aperture that you'll find me shooting at when I'm shooting a landscape. If there's nothing tricky, like something really, really close to the front of the lens, but you have a moderate depth of field, you have something 10 feet away from you and something that's in the distance, I'm just going to shoot at f16 and call it good. I'm not going to focus stack or anything else. It's probably going to be just fine, especially if you're on a crop sensor camera. Now, you don't want to get too high. You'll see some lenses, especially the telephoto lenses, like a 70 to 300 or something. Sometimes they'll go up to like f40 on the aperture. And a few times as I've walked around at a workshop, I've said, what's your aperture? Just kind of checking on people. And so I'm at f32, and it's like, whoa,
Whoa, don't do that.
unless it's a really crazy specialized situation, I would never really go above f22. A lot of lenses just won't even go above f22, but some do. And the reason is because of diffraction, which is kind of outside the scope of this video. But generally for landscapes, I think somewhere between f14 and f18 is kind of a sweet spot, so that you're still getting a nice sharp image and also getting your depth of field. But again, you don't have to worry about this as much with a crop sensor. Also, it's getting more popular on cell phones. You're seeing cell phones that are giving you manual control, and so people are like, "Oh, I'm shooting a landscape. I want to shoot at f16." No, don't. The reason that your iPhone, like if you actually look at your settings, it's choosing like f3, f3.4, f5.6 at the most for most of your shots, f2.8 on an iPhone or really any cell phone. And why? Because that's tons of depth of field. It's hard to get shallow depth of field on a cell phone, even when it's shooting at f2.8, because the sensor is tiny. So don't kind of fall into that trap of I need to get manual control for my cell phone, maybe for the shutter speed, but not really for other things, because it's shooting super wide for a reason.
Yep.